yeah, being able to communicate vision, I guess, is the real trick to making a good game. And I think that's why indie teams with very small teams often do quite well. 4-man teams, 15-man teams, because the vision is like simpler to communicate to that many people.
Hey everybody, Tanner here with WAGMI Ventures. On today's episode, we have Toby Saunders, co-founder and CEO at Cathedral Studios, creators of the Bornless. For anyone who's new, this is the WAGMI Ventures podcast, where we do snapshots with interesting founders from across Web3. Check out wagmiventures.io to learn more about the syndicate behind the podcast. But for now, let's get into it with Toby from Cathedral Studios. All right. Hey, everybody. I'm here today with Toby Saunders, co-founder and CEO at Cathedral Studios, creators of the Bornless. Toby, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Tanner.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat. This is going to be great. So maybe just introduce yourself here to start and just tell us a little bit about your kind of professional story and what brought you to building Cathedral Studios.
Yeah, cool. Well, yeah, so I originally came from a film and TV background. So storytelling, I guess, is my jam. I kind of came from film, TV, and I originally picked up Unreal Engine as a real-time renderer. Anyone who's seen like Mandalorian might be familiar with something called virtual cinema. So it's similar to how you would have like a green screen in the background of a movie. You can use Unreal Engine and have a big TV, basically, and then you can render 3D real-time environments on these TVs. And it's the same, essentially, tool and process as game development. So I picked up that tool for virtual cinema, and I was using it as a VFX tool, similar to how I think they did it in Black Panther as well.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so I was mucking around with that and slipped down the rabbit hole of game development a few years ago, or probably more than a few years ago now. Time flies. But yeah, fell down the rabbit hole, started making games for fun, and was basically moonlighting indie game developer. And after a long enough timeline, it was no longer moonlighting; it was sort of daylighting. And then before I knew it, I was kind of obsessed making indie games, and I was making different bits and bobs, and then it was through one project that kind of caught on YouTube, got picked up by GameSpot and YouTube Gaming. It was a remake of Final Fantasy X. Don't know if you're familiar with it.
Oh, cool, game. Yeah.
I remade it in Unreal Engine, and
the whole thing.
No, just the environments.
Okay, cool.
Not the whole game. That would be
dear God.
I'm waiting for someone to do that. Square Enix, if you're listening. But yeah, so I off the back of this kind of big passion project, I put a lot of time into it. While I was still working on my own film production company with my brother, who's co-founder of Cathedral. And then, as this passion project, remade Final Fantasy in Unreal Engine, and then it kicked off, and GameSpot picked it up, and it kind of went viral on the day. And I think it was about 600,000 views. It was off the back of that kind of virality that I met some really talented developers, games developers, and we started game jamming. And I was also into Web3 and NFTs, and I was trading to kind of supplement my income at the time. And I saw this really interesting model of Web3 in gaming, and I thought, how could I not try this? How could I not experiment with this? And here we are, a couple of years later with a pretty strong alpha for a game called the Bornless.
Very cool. Very cool.
So that's the origin story, I guess.
Love it. Yeah. Okay. So what is Cathedral Studios building? What is the Bornless? Maybe to start.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So the Bornless is a horror FPS. It's kind of survival horror built in Unreal Engine. We're currently porting over to 5.1.1 right now, which is going to be fun. It is a a good way to think about it is as an indie horror. There's lots of you'll read a lot in Web3 gaming about AAA this, AAA that, but the indie development approach is also a really, really productive, small, lean teams, really talented developers working on kind of quirky experiences is what the horror genre, at least on PC, has thrived on. So what the Bornless is we're taking all of these different horror indie experiences and merging them into this one terrifying, nasty, horrible experience. So basically, my pitch for Bornless is, what is it? Well, if you have a phobia, then it's in the Bornless. So spiders, check. Snakes, check. Clowns, check.
Yep.
What else have we got coming up next? Wendigos, all sorts of horrible things.
Yep.
And our first kind of flagship game mode is essentially it's a battle royale. It's kind of like a battle royale, but with some asymmetric horror twists, a little bit like Dead by Daylight. And in the Bornless, you go back and forth between these horror experiences. You go out into the world, into these horror experiences, and then you bring your spoils back to your base camp, your safe house, where you and your buddies build up your home base, essentially. So it's a kind of social game with lots of different horror experiences all connected together with a really messed up story I'm very excited to tell, but it's based on the story is based on a book. So anyone
I wanted to ask you about this. So
anyone interested in the lore of the Bornless, I encourage you to Google the Lesser Key of Solomon, and anyone interested in horror, it's a big rabbit hole for you there, so enjoy. But it's a public domain book, very interesting book. It's essentially a demonology grimoire. So any demons that have been featured in sort of Judeo-Christian religious texts over the last 2,000 years are all collected in this one book. And then in Bornless, we just go through this book and we pick a demon and we depict it through some phobia in our game.
I find that fascinating. That fascinating. You don't that connection just to like a real world text as kind of an animating inspiration for the lore and story. I feel like you don't hear about that too often. Maybe I'm out of touch or something, but I thought that was a really unique angle.
There's some really great inspirations to draw from if you really dive into the horror genre. This book appears in more places than it's kind of spooky how often this book gets referenced. And as you start to peel back the layers of horror writing, you find this book, creeping around the corner a lot of the times. Hereditary is a great example. A24, Ari Aster, fantastic horror film, Hereditary, has the demon Paimon, who's also in this book.
Got it. Super interesting. Okay. So I'm curious here at the start too, before we maybe dig more into the company itself, I'm curious, how does your team think about what makes a great game? Like what factors aren't obvious to people that your team considers important in terms of what makes great gameplay or a great story, et cetera? I feel like there's some breadcrumbs or clues kind of already in what you've already mentioned, but
it's such a good question. That is such a good question. So we fight, we fight tooth and nail in our studio for what we think is good game design and what is fun, because they're sort of two different things. Good game design is not always fun. It's a very complex issue. Of like how to make a fun game. Obviously on like an operational and business level, like it's a lengthy, difficult, expensive process that takes like a lot of talent. But in terms of the kind of artistry of it, it's so subjective, and you discuss one of the things our lead programmer says. He's a great programmer, Liv. He talks about feel a lot. And feel is something kind of harder to quantify, especially when you're talking about like genre tropes, like horror, for example. I do not feel as scared of the snake monster as I do of the spider monster. And you can look at data, and you can look at Steam charts, and you can look at databases of what phobias do well in gaming and all the rest of it. But there is another element of feel to game design, which is kind of hard to quantify. We spoke with Lee Perry. Lee Perry's he was the game designer on Gears of War 1 and 2, and he was very generous and gave us some advice early on, which was be aware that when you're working with horror, that everyone on your team is going to have a different idea of what horror means. And the horror shooter genre, they work very, very well together. But they come with some interesting compromises that you have to identify early on and make room for. And just being aware that not everyone is scared of the same thing and all the rest of it.
Yeah, that's kind of fascinating. It's so subjective and personal. And I'm sure there's a question of like, how do you be universally, in some sense, like in some way, whether it's, it sounds like you're kind of involving a variety of phobias and kind of zeroing in on like the feel in this intangible sense that, somehow maybe it's a spot, you can spot it, but you can't exactly quantify it kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I get how that would be a complicated process where it's probably not easy to summarize how that happens.
It's a very enjoyable back and forth, I tell you, especially when you've got talented people on the team who really challenge you to communicate your ideas. Our head of game, Branton, is such a talented developer, and I obviously wish I had his job because he has the fun job. But me being able to take the vision that I have in my head of what the Bornless is and communicate it to many, many people so that we can all attack the same vision is a challenge. But it's also really inspiring when I communicate my vision to Branton, our head of game, and he comes back and he says, this part of your vision doesn't work, and let me tell you why. And then I can work with him on that, and he can propose all of the holes in a game loop, or there's a lot of creative back and forth, and it's being able to communicate vision, I guess, is the real trick to making a good game. And I think that's why indie teams with very small teams often do quite well, 4-man teams, 15-man teams, because the vision is like simpler to communicate to that many people. Sons of the Forest has just come out. It's a great example of a horror game with a smaller team, from indie roots, absolutely crushing the Steam charts at the moment. One of so popular, it's just like, I think it locked up Steam the other day, like Steam crashed because of the amount of people playing it. Small team, indie game, horror game.
Love it.
Yeah,
very cool. So we've talked a little bit about sort of game design in sort of some broader terms, but I'm curious about how Web3 intersects with this. And on your Gitbook, you guys talk a little bit about your Web3 philosophy at Cathedral Studios. I'd love to learn a little bit more about how you see Web3 adding value to users instead of kind of extracting it, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. Yes. Did you pull that question from the Gitbook? Because that's exactly...
I pulled it exactly from the Gitbook.
yeah, that's fantastic. Yep. So the Web3 is such a tricky one, and I and everyone on the Cathedral team are very cautious with the way that we approach our Web3 models and the tech, because even though we are fundamental believers in the technology, there are some problems, mostly on an industry and regulatory level, that need to get solved in order for us to make games for customers in a way that's like sustainable and safe and good for the customer.
Yeah.
And the industry is changing, and Amazon's moving, and Square Enix and Ubisoft, and it is changing, and it will change. But I think that a lot of games were quick to rush down models that aren't built for the future. Implementing versions of Web3 that might not have a user's interest really at heart. And I think Web3 tech, when done correctly, I think surely is this incredible tool that enables communities to structure and organize themselves and have fun together and have meaningful connections with one another. I think that's one of the interesting things you see in the NFT space is how tight-knit these communities of NFT traders become, and how they form such meaningful friendships with one another. Some of the people I work with now were NFT degens who I traded with, way back, and you can make really interesting connections with people online, and Web3 is a kind of facilitator of that. And if done right in gaming, it's a proponent of collaboration, I think, and that's why it's used so much for trade, right? Web3 is used so much for trade,
sure,
because it's a really simple form of human collaboration. There's lots of other ways to use Web3, and there's lots of really interesting teams out there using Web3 to solve problems. Shrapnel's a cool one, obviously. They've got some interesting ideas. Some of their ideas will work, some of them won't work, right? And I think our mission with Web3 is to land on something that is actually shippable at scale in a realistic market in a traditional gaming ecosystem. Not reinventing the wheel. There will be games that reinvent the wheel, and that's fantastic. But I think it's going to take a while for those games to actually get made. I don't think they're coming in the next maybe even 5 years. I think it'll be more like 5 to 10.
Got it.
But I think the web games developers who are interested in Web3 right now are charged with this problem of mass adoption, and it's such a it's chasing this dragon, because mass adoption really just means lots of users, right? People who love your game and want to play it.
Yeah.
And it's no different a problem from any indie developer making a game on Steam, mass adoption. That's the
right.
It's the same thing.
People who love our thing.
people who love our thing. People who are genuinely want to have the experience that you're providing.
Yeah.
I'm being very ambiguous about the actual implementations of the tech. The actual implementations of the tech are digital collectibles, the ability for players to own assets and trade them, a push towards interoperability with other experiences that we like. Those are the tangible sort of this is what we're actually working on.
Yeah.
But yeah, on a broader level, I think it's about making sure that we're aligned with the big pieces of the industry, and that consumer protection and regulation and healthy models for gaming are kind of built into the core of the fabric of the Web3 products, essentially. It's a long answer, but I hope that touches on the...
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. I'd love to, maybe when we can have you back on the show, I'd love to hear more about, even just the regulatory piece or the consumer protection piece, kind of more in detail on that. But I'm curious right now, what has stood out as most surprising in your work building Cathedral Studios so far? What weren't you expecting as you've kind of embarked on this journey?
Oh, well, that's a tough one. It's something new every week, I feel. What have I learned? I've learned that a really talented developer can do things that are notable even to the big fish.
Yeah.
And it only takes one or two developers to do something wicked. And if you believe in really good talent, you can be blown away by the kind of stuff they can do. It doesn't matter if they're someone fresh out of university or just an untapped indie dev who's been at it for 10 years or a AAA guy who's moved from ex-Ubisoft or whatever. When you are able to find really good talent and apply them to a clever problem, it impresses the big fish. We've been, for a small indie studio, we've been very fortunate to work very closely with Amazon on some AI machine learning stuff. Get to play test the game with. I don't want to just do a series of name dropping. I guess that's a bit boring. But it's amazing how talented people working on cool shit essentially is like all you have to do to be the tip of the spear. You just have to have talented people making really, really cool shit and bring all those people into one room, and it's amazing what they can do.
Yeah, that's a great lesson.
Yeah.
It almost reminds me of that saying, like, be so good they can't ignore you, where
exactly.
No matter how big the team is, no matter, like, if the thing is really, really remarkable, like, that is kind of the table stakes. And at that point, a lot of doors unlock or a lot of opportunities unlock that you might not have predicted if the thing is really, really exceptional.
Exactly, yeah. And, our team at the moment, like some of our programmers, Aaron, one of our programmers, is working on some stuff with Stable Diffusion and OpenAI, and it's there's
possibilities are probably really, really exciting for.
I think Cathedral's going to have a good run, basically, and
love it. So from your vantage point, you mentioned some of the things people are talking about happening sooner than later. You are actually a little bit more bearish on. So I'm curious in general, and you can take this any direction you want. But where do you see gaming going, or blockchain gaming specifically? With the unique unlocks enabled there, like, say we do anchor to kind of 3 to 5 years, what changes can gamers expect or developers expect, gaming companies expect? Big question, but just curious your thoughts on future trajectory of the space.
Yeah. So I think big IPs are going to start moving over to Web3 in dribs and drabs, and they're going to fail at doing it. I have no idea if Call of Duty is doing Web3. That this is just an example of a big name, big IP.
Yeah.
If Call of Duty were to do an NFT collection, they would see kickback, and there would be problems, and they would figure out the problems, and everyone in Web3 would be better for it, because we would see a big IP make a move in that direction and see how a big studio tackles that type of problem, and how regulatory, like, what do their terms of service look like? How did they get that asset pushed onto Xbox Live? How did they get around the Steam problem? What did Sony think about it? And seeing big IPs from house name, big brand studios come through the door will let us know what the progress is actually going to look like over the next 5 years. But I think probably some of the real unlock will be on some of the problems that Web3 will solve that we might not have even identified yet. I think Web3 potentially solves one problem, which is computing, particularly like AI asset rendering, because the more that we see AI models put into our games, the more some games are going to explore cloud computing or decentralized computing, or whatever kind of methods you want to use. Web3 becomes an interesting solution there, potentially. There's lots of different routes. I mean, I know that OpenAI is using a token model already, and Stable Diffusion, the ability to have that within game files. Potentially you have I won't go too much into it because we might maybe getting into the weeds, but I think Web3 potentially, like, there'll be another unlock that we might not have seen coming happen in the next few years, which will then circle back to gaming and digital collectibles and the way that we are currently using this tech. I think in the next 5 years we'll realize, like, oh, that's how it's actually supposed to be done. Awesome. But I think that the experiences between now and then will be more like a Web 2.5 approach. A solid 20% improvement upon existing gaming ecosystems, like integrating the tech in a way that actually makes sense and improves the experience. That's not at the cost of gamers. 2.5 leaning into 3. And I think games that build assuming that that's the trajectory, that pickup is going to be slow and that the game has to come first and it has to all be about the gamer, and then just getting the foundation laid for incredible decentralized user-generated experiences. Those are that's kind of where I see it's going, and in about 5 years, I think that's when these experiences will really be popping off and looking amazing. Or maybe it's a shorter timeline, but I think that's it's going. We're not there yet, and it's not going to be a 1 to 2 year thing. I don't think either.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, just the thought that there may be problems now or technology now that it's just not the right time yet. More needs to happen, and certain things just the uncertainty of the future may present different routes to different routes for old technologies, or different routes to solving old problems, right? I think that's an interesting trajectory that I haven't heard too much about.
Yeah,
so
I think interoperability, I guess, is an important point. I'll close on that with, because interoperability is the dream of Web3, right? The ability for me to take some beautiful, awesome asset that I love and put it in the experience that I desire and move it back and forth. Ready Player One style, right? Wear my outfit in any game that I want.
Yeah.
And interoperability is hard. That problem isn't solved by Web3. It's partially solved by Web3, but the easy bit is solved by Web3. The hard bit of interoperability is done on a engine level and on a standardization of code bases level, and that's where it's really complex to do interoperability, and it requires some collaboration that's gonna not be simple to implement. So the real ultimate dream of Web3 is interoperability, and that's going to take that problem is solved by Epic, not by Ethereum.
Interesting. Yeah, it's fascinating. Okay, so what's got you most excited for the future of the Bornless and Cathedral Studios? Where, if everything continues to go well, what directions have got you most excited to continue pursuing?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So for us, Bornless is a franchise. It's not a game. So it's not just one experience. It's not just one game. It's not just Bornless and then we're done. We're building it to be a franchise.
Got it.
And with that, I get to be my most ambitious self and say, Tanner, in 2 years we're going to have a Netflix show. We're going to have a Netflix show. It's going to be incredible. The Bornless is gonna be everywhere. But I think whatever happens, the game is gonna have a community of people who love it. It already does. And all we have to do is scale up this community, and it's gonna be a really good time. I think that once we start leaving alpha, and we've clicked all the pieces of the puzzle together, I'm excited to see some of my favorite YouTubers play it. Basically, I think that's when I'll really start thinking oh yeah, okay, we've arrived.
We made it.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Because it's going to be such a good finish line once I can kick back on a lunch break and watch Mark Plyer play Bornless.
That's awesome.
That's what I'm looking forward to.
Very cool. Okay, maybe 2 last questions here, Toby. First question, what advice would you have for founders building in the Web3 space? Maybe your most generalizable advice for those founders.
Yeah, I think there's so many lessons every week, or every day sometimes if it's a busy week. And I think don't overextend, don't overpromise. Respect the basic fundamentals of business. Don't think that just because you're in an emerging market that scale up immediately is the right move. What's the line? It's some people act too quickly when they're trying to make money and too slowly when they're trying to protect it.
Oh, interesting.
So just spend time, master the basic business fundamentals, because you'll save yourself a headache. take operations seriously, like from day one if you can, but also be willing to take risks and like take on some of that operational debt. Progress sometimes is messy, and you have to just chase things down and get on with it. And talent, I guess, is the last one. Find really good people who are better than you at things, and convince them to help you.
Love it. Okay, Toby, what is your team working on right now, and what's the best way for people to follow along in the journey?
Yeah, so we're working on the Bornless. We have got a lot of other things cooking up, but we can't talk about them just yet. But you can find us at cathedral-studios.com for the studio, or if you want to look just at the game, you can go to thebornless.com. Thebornless.com is probably the best spot to really look into what we're working on.
Love it. Toby, this is awesome. Thank you so much for the time. I hope your week kicks off great here, and look forward to chatting again soon.
Amazing. Thanks, Tanner.